All right, this is Openstax U.S. History, Chapter 6, America's War for Independence, 1775 to 1783, Section 1, Britain's Law and Order Strategy and its Consequences. So just to recap real quickly, Chapter 5 was more or less about the causes of the conflict between the 13 colonies and Great Britain, and we can just sort of list some important events that occurred. Recall it was the 7 Years' War that left Great Britain with a huge war debt. This led to the passage of the Stamp Act, which was designed to raise revenue. The colonists met, protested, got it repealed. It was replaced by the Townshend duties, which for a period of time taxed a number of different goods, but especially in the aftermath of the Boston Massacre and the violence which occurred, it only left a tax on tea. The Tea Act was then passed in order to the Tea Act was passed in order to save the British East India Company, but it also forced the colonists to pay the tea tax. So rather than paying the tea tax, the people in Boston particularly decided that they would rather dump the tea into the Boston Harbor, which they did, which led to the Boston Tea Party. And because the colonists had dumped all this tea into the harbor, Parliament responded with the coercive acts, which are designed to punish Massachusetts. This overreach in the eyes of many colonists led to the other colonies meeting at the First Continental Congress. And that's really where we begin in Chapter 6 with the First Continental Congress. Recall, the purpose of the First Continental Congress is to get Parliament to repeal the coercive acts. These acts were designed to punish Massachusetts, to isolate Massachusetts. It involved dissolving their representative government, closing down the port of Boston. It involved a new quartering act, etc., etc. The petition was sent to Great Britain. The colonists maintained that they were loyal to the crown, but that these acts, particularly the coercive acts, that they essentially had to go. Because in those days, it took a long time for communications to travel. It could take a month to cross the Atlantic Ocean to get a reply. At the very quickest, it might be 2 months. For that particular reason, you had a lot transpiring in the meantime, particularly in this city of Boston, in the colony of Massachusetts, which had become kind of like the problem child for Great Britain during this whole series of events. General Thomas Gage, he was the British general who was in charge of Boston. At that time, because the assembly was dissolved, it was under military rule. The colonists, worrying that there might be a conflict, prepared potentially for an armed showdown. And so the Minutemen, or a Minuteman, was a citizen soldier who was supposed to be potentially to be sort of, ready at a minute's notice, that in case there is some sort of conflict that breaks out with the British, because it was under military rule, because there were quite a substantial number of British troops in Boston, these Minutemen were citizen soldiers that were supposed to be ready. They were training, they were drilling for whatever the British may do. And the British, sure enough, did act. General Thomas Gage was given the order to confiscate munitions in Concord. Munitions are essentially guns. So the idea was to confiscate them. General Thomas Gage also was ordered to arrest the following colonial leaders: John Hancock, who was a merchant; Samuel Adams, who was very active in the Sons of Liberty. If you recall, the Sons of Liberty was an anti-British group that had been active for quite some time, and so the calls to arrest John Hancock, Samuel Adams, and to confiscate the weapons that were in the colonies. Concord is a city, so the idea was that Gage was going to go to Concord, Massachusetts, take the weapons, arrest kind of these individuals who are provoking a conflict with Great Britain, and that would make the situation more safe, so to speak. Thomas Gage was not a dumb guy. He thought that he could sneak out of Boston towards Concord, Massachusetts. However, he was found by colonial residents. Probably most famous of them all was Paul Revere. Paul Revere warned the Minutemen ahead of time that Gage and his men had moved out of Boston and were heading presumably to Concord. This is his famous ride where he says, "The British are coming," right, at midnight, warning the colonists that they're coming. And what occurred was the first battle of the American Revolution, and that is Lexington and Concord, first battle of the American Revolution. Enough Minutemen met in Lexington, Massachusetts, which was a city, and they were there designed to try and stop the British from continuing their march to Concord to confiscate those guns, and they exchanged gunfire. And that exchange of gunfire not only marked the first battle of the American Revolution, but it also is called the shot heard round the world, or the beginning of the American Revolution. So the shot heard around the world is a reference to the beginning of this revolutionary movement. That sparked off various conflicts throughout. For the colonial side, or for the Minutemen, for the colonists, what was very important for them was to potentially confiscate, well, not really confiscate, that's maybe a bad word, to capture British arms. And so colonial leaders, Ethan Allen, so these are colonial leaders, Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold lead a group of colonists to the British fort of Fort Ticonderoga, and in fact do capture and successfully take that over. So that is what we might call a colonial victory. What they find there are mainly cannons, and really during the course of the conflict of the American Revolution, one thing that we'll learn is that for the colonists, the militiamen, the Continental Army, however we refer to them as, they typically tend to be short on weapons, heavy weapons like cannons especially. So the fact that Ethan Allen, Benedict Arnold, and other members of the Massachusetts militia were successful in overtaking this British fort and getting those weapons was a boost to their war effort. It should be mentioned that at the Battle of Lexington and Concord, the British soldiers did eventually make their way to Concord. By the time that they got there, most of the weapons were already taken out. The munitions area was actually set on fire, and eventually the British were forced to retreat back to Boston. So British retreat to Boston, and really Boston was where the British were the strongest in the barracks there. After successfully confiscating, or again, confiscate is probably not a good word here, capturing British arms, those were taken to Boston, in which the British position was sieged. The colonists put themselves up on a hill on a defensive position. The British attacked. This conflict was known as the Battle of Bunker Hill. It was a very bloody and costly battle for Britain. Even though the British were able to dislodge the militia from the hill, it was actually fought on Breed's Hill, they experienced a high number of casualties and a high number of deaths, ultimately forcing the British to evacuate Boston altogether. So the British evacuate from Boston and go to Canada, right? So the British successfully had taken the hill, but they suffered so many losses, they retreated back to Boston and eventually just left Massachusetts altogether because there was too much anti-British sentiment. Meanwhile, as this fighting is breaking out, so this is all happening in Massachusetts, it's up to the other colonists to respond and the other colonies to respond. And their responses, there are a range of responses that come from the different colonies. In North Carolina, the Mecklenburg resolves essentially distance the colonies from Great Britain. It is a formal, or at least a proclaimed, separation. So you do have some calling for a separation from Great Britain given the circumstances that have transpired in Massachusetts, Lexington and Concord, the Battle of Bunker Hill, the Siege of Boston, etc., etc. And so those who advocated for a separation are known as patriots. So patriots, they essentially support or want independence, right? So they are fighting on the side of an independent 13 colonies. A loyalist is essentially on the side with Great Britain. And even during the course of the American Revolution itself, we can sort of divide colonial society into thirds. That is, 1/3 would consider themselves patriots, 1/3 would consider themselves loyalists or loyal to England, and 1/3 could really go either way. So in terms of those people in the colonies who supported breaking away from the British Empire, it was only approximately 1/3 of the population that did that. 1/3 of the population, despite the fighting taking place, still wanted to remain loyal to the English crown. And so in some cases, the American Revolution is a civil war as well, because the colonists themselves were divided. In other places like Virginia, Dunmore, who was the governor of Virginia, proclaimed that if any slaves, again, sensing that there was conflict on the horizon, Governor of Virginia, Lord Dunmore, proclaims that if any slaves fight for Great Britain, slaves that fight for Britain, they will be given their freedom, right? So any slaves that fight for Britain will be given their freedom. Dunmore's proclamation had the effect, essentially, of, what we might call pushing the southern colonies to independence, right? So especially a lot of southern slaveholders who were really quite, were quite against what Dunmore was trying to do sort of find themselves on the same side as the northern colonies like Massachusetts in favoring to break away from Great Britain. Now, at the time, as these events are unfolding, as a literal war is unfolding before their eyes, and that's an important thing to understand here too, is that when we think about the American Revolution, it is that the fighting takes place first. The war begins first, and then it is independence. It's not the other way around. It's not as if the 13 colonies declared independence and then the fighting started. It's actually the fighting started, and that went a long way in persuading really the colonial population that, well, if you're already fighting and killing one another, well, then the logical step is, of course, to separate and create a brand new country. And we see that with Dunmore's proclamation and the Mecklenburg Resolves. At the same time as this was unfolding, you had perhaps one of the most influential pamphlets, pieces of political literature published in all of American history, and that was Common Sense. That was written by Thomas Paine. He is the author of Common Sense. And very straightforward and very clearly, Thomas Paine made the argument that it was common sense for the colonies to break away and declare their independence from Great Britain. He called the English monarch a brute. Probably one of the more famous sayings from Common Sense is, why should an island rule over an entire continent? He used language that everyday people could understand, and this was coming at exactly the right time to mobilize people into favoring or siding with this independence movement. Thomas Paine talked about republicanism, which is elected government. The King of England, the king isn't elected, right? Parliament is elected, but it's not elected by anybody in the colonies. And so he put forward the case that, well, the colonists need an elected government of themselves. Popular sovereignty is the idea that people should decide. You can kind of think about it like democracy, right? Popular meaning the people, sovereignty meaning the right to rule themselves, and declared that in fact the legitimate government of the 13 colonies was in fact this independence movement. And so this hit the press right at the right time. It was the highest selling and most widely read thing in the colonies on the eve of the American Revolution, and really did a lot to push, especially for those that were not necessarily involved in the events themselves, push them into favoring this War of Independence. It wasn't until, of course, July when the Second Continental Congress met Now recall when the first Continental Congress met, they had tried to repeal the Intolerable Acts. And the idea was that the Intolerable Acts that those would be repealed. Not only were those on the books, but what the Congress had on their hands was essentially a war. So the attitudes at the Second Continental Congress are dramatically different. And probably the most important thing to come out of this second meeting of the colonies is the Declaration of Independence, which formally breaks ties, or breaks the political ties, with Great Britain. The document itself was a group project by 5 individuals. Thomas Jefferson is the main author of it, right? So he, in fact, wrote most of it. John Adams, the lawyer from Massachusetts, of course, is part of it as well. And the Declaration of Independence, for the most part, is just a list of grievances, everything that the British Empire has done against the colonies, and the reason for why they're breaking away. But perhaps the most well-known part of it is the preamble, and it's the preamble of the Declaration of Independence that really reflects all of the Enlightenment principles, or what we might call the founding principles for which the United States is founded on. It talks about how people have universal rights or natural rights. Thomas Jefferson lists them as life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Right, that everybody is born with these rights, that they are inalienable, and it's really the job of governments to protect them. And governments are, through the consent of the governed. Of course, this is a callback to this idea of the social contract. Right, taxation and representation is also kind of how we cover this thing. And that if governments are not doing that, if they're not responsive to the people, if they're not in a contract with the people, if they're not kind of elected in that way, and they're not protecting people's rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, then people have the right to alter or abolish it. And that is really the justification for breaking away from Great Britain. Now, this was written not just to create kind of the founding principles and to establish all the reasons as to why the British or why the colonists wanted to break away, but there was also some very sort of practical or realpolitik going on, and that was to also win French and Spanish support. So this document, the Declaration of Independence, was written with that in mind, that in order to be successful in this conflict against Great Britain, the United States would need French and Spanish support. So this was also kind of a plea to those nations to potentially help. Of course, within the Declaration of Independence, and this is going to be very important moving forward, is the fact that you have these Enlightenment principles, this principle of universal rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and the fact that that will really, for as long as the United States exists, contradict with the institution of slavery, which was practiced not just by most Americans at that time, but in fact, even Thomas Jefferson himself, who wrote the Declaration of Independence. And so we will talk a lot more, especially as we kind of progress throughout American history, about how those founding principles contradict with sort of the real world applications of them.